Welcome everyone, thanks for coming along, great to see you. Great to get webinars up and running again, especially as now people hopefully have a bit more to do outdoors as well as in front of the computer screens. I was delighted when Tom has been posting a number of things on LinkedIn about the NEC contracts. Do seek them out if you can, and I'm sure we can share links with those things after the event as well, Tom, if that's okay.
Yep.
Tom's been thinking quite hard about the NEC, and it's great to see somebody who has been on our Masters in Construction Law continuing that thinking process. And I see today's talk as a way of further developing that. So Tom is going to be speaking about the NEC. I'll leave him to go through the detail of it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but it's a very interesting contract from an academic point of view as well as a practical point of view. It tries to do something a bit different from other standard forms of building contract with its focus on engagement and collaboration. The extent to which it's successful at that is something I think we'll discuss tonight. And I don't want to hold on too long, but I think it's useful just to put that in mind, that this is something, a contract that's trying to do something different, and what is it trying to do different, and how well does it work? Those are the questions that I'm going to have in mind, and look forward to hearing from Tom just now. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, David. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for taking the time to join me today in this presentation on the NEC. I'm sure many of you will have attended seminars on the NEC that are highly theoretical and assume that the parties will act in a fair and reasonable manner towards each other. This is not one of those presentations. What I plan to do today is to provide a brief overview of the NEC to set the scene. I'll then focus on the three areas that are unique to NEC contracts: the programme, compensation event mechanism, and the explicit obligation for the parties to collaborate. I'll explain the practical difficulties that emanate from each of these areas and how the unmodified terms actually serve to exacerbate disputes, which is arguably a reason as to why there are so many Z clauses. So by way of a brief introduction, the NEC came to prominence following Sir Michael Latham's 1994 report, Constructing the Team, which cited the NEC as part of the solution in stemming the adversarial nature that was prevalent in the construction industry at the time. Arguably, little has changed. The differences between the... Sorry? Oh, sorry, someone said something there. The differences between the NEC and other standard forms are self-evident. But the plain English wording and the explicit obligation to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation are examples of the step change from traditional drafting, particularly the JCT. The changes were intended to encourage collaborative working and provide certainty to the project in terms of time, cost, and quality. And while such rationale is laudable, in my experience, the NEC's terms can be troublesome and frequently lead to disputes. Proponents of the NEC will maintain that any issues are born out of the Z clause amendments and have nothing to do with the original terms. For the benefit of any students on the call, Z clauses are modified terms of contract, typically included by the client's legal team. In terms of Z clauses, I personally attended seminars where prominent individuals involved with the NEC were of the opinion that if you consider Z clauses are necessary, then don't use the NEC. This is a particularly idealistic perspective, and certainly one a view not shared by clients. Let's now look at the NEC program. So unlike most of the contract forms, the importance of the program and an NEC project cannot be overstated. Not only is it afforded contractual status, which is atypical when compared with other standard forms, but failure to achieve acceptance obligates the project manager to assess the impact of all compensation events. In order for the contractor to receive an acceptance of its program by the project manager, the submission must show all of the information listed under clause 31.2, which includes 17 separate criteria. Some of the requirements are self-evident and simple to include, such as the starting date. However, other criteria are commonly contentious, such as time risk allowance. Time risk allowance isn't defined in the contract, but if we look at the assessment mechanism for compensation events, time risk allowance is a period included in the programme for matters which are the contractor's risk and have a significant chance of occurring. Well, what does a significant chance mean? And what allowance is reasonable to include? Such contingency allowance is clearly a matter of opinion, and as such will be a matter of contention. Another programme criterion that is frequently controversial is the obligation to include, for each operation, a statement of how the contractor plans to do the work, identifying the principal equipment and other resources which he plans to use. This can be an issue because the vast majority of large capital projects are design and build, with contracts being let on the basis of client requirements and preliminary drawings. In the early stages of such a project, there are often numerous unknowns relating to the post-contract delivery of activities, as the final design will be pending. In these circumstances, completing all of the clause 31.2 criteria will frequently not be possible. But what does this mean in reality? Well, from a contractual perspective, the project manager should reject a program that fails to satisfy all of the clause 31.2 requirements on the basis that it does not show the information the contract requires, an explicit reason for program rejection by the project manager. Yet the project manager is faced with a predicament. His foremost duty is to discharge the functions he is expressly required to perform under the contract. But he, along with the parties, is also obligated to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. The vast majority of project managers I have come across when faced with this choice prefer the pragmatic approach, at least at the outset. Programs that are therefore non-compliant are frequently accepted on the basis that a rejection could be construed as unreasonable and at odds with the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. So what's the problem with this? The project manager has acted collaboratively, and surely this should be reciprocated by the contractor. The contractor could respond in kind if it's in his interest to do so, for example, if he's on a framework contract. However, on a single capital project, in my experience, the contractor will take the opportunity to manipulate the program. But why? Well, the answer is commercial gain. The contractor is aware that the individuals that require convincing that the program should be accepted are the project manager, who in my experience looks only at the high level information such as changes to plan completion, and the client side planner, who invariably is working on multiple projects and typically provides a score through software such as Acumen Views to identify any integrity issues, for example, negative flow or unlinked activities. If these checks flag no problems, then the program is likely to be accepted. Changes by the contractor to his activity durations, flow and lags are rarely scrutinized, and as such can be manipulated to suit his requirements, which will be driven by the contractual risk profile. A typical example of this is earthworks. Not only will the site information invariably be inaccurate, but there will undoubtedly, on a large scheme, be numerous objects encountered, which could satisfy the physical condition CE under 60.112, the wording to which is, the contractor encounters a physical condition which an experienced contractor would have judged at the contract date to have such a small chance of occurring that it would have been unreasonable for him to have allowed for them. Ask any contractor what he will have allowed for, and the answer will be precisely what is identified in the site information. Ask any project manager or client, and the answer is that a reasonable allowance should be included. But what's a reasonable allowance? In the case of obstructions, would a 1 metre allowance be reasonable from an object identified in the site information? 2 metres perhaps? The answer is subjective. So how will a contractor maximise such an opportunity? Activity durations for operations that lend themselves to compensation events will be artificially optimistic and close to critical. The contractor's commercial team will invariably be deployed to identify some evidence to satisfy a physical condition CE. The most fanciful effort I've encountered to this regard is a photograph of a Coke can used to demonstrate an unidentified obstruction. Amusing to a degree, but nevertheless shows intent. On the basis that entitlement is agreed, the compensation event will include for a delay to the activity, which will have been engineered to be critical. That is, plan completion is now later than plan completion on the accepted program. This results in the preliminaries, which are usually a substantial daily sum, becoming recoverable, and this usually accounts for a substantial proportion of the quotation amount. Any retrospective attempt by the project manager to discredit the program on which the compensation event was impacted, with the aim of reducing the prelim recovery, will be futile if the program was accepted by the project manager, even if it was not contractually compliant. This scenario has the potential for the project manager to be held liable for negligence. Once the project manager has been bitten by this tactic once, the typical reaction is to reject future program submissions for any reason available in order to avoid a repeat. This is an understandable response, but the result is that the project manager is now obligated under clause 64.1 to assess all compensation events. It should be noted that this is not optional. As he will be unlikely to have a handle on the specifics of the program, as is typically the case in major projects which include tens of thousands of activities, such mandatory assessment of compensation events by the project manager has the potential to result in highly subjective outcomes, especially for those events that involve a significant time impact. So despite the intention of the NEC program being a project management tool that provides transparency of operations on a regular basis, the reality is that it is frequently the source of disputes. It is hardly any wonder program-related clauses are subject to so many Z clause amendments. Well, what are clients doing to avoid this? Well, clients are generally aware of the brinkmanship that stems from the unamended clauses that relate to the NEC program, and are modifying the terms to include varying states of acceptance available to the project manager. The requirement to fully resource portions of work over a specific period, and commercial ramifications in the event that the contractor fails to comply, such as disallowing cost or commercial rights of set-off. These are prudent measures. Now let's move on to the specifics of the compensation event mechanism. The compensation event procedure is prescriptive, with sequential steps of notification, quotation, assessment, and implementation. So what could go wrong? The problem is, and as I touched on in the program section, issues arise when there are elements of subjectivity, and there is nothing like a forecast of a financial impact based on a dividing date as a precursor to a dispute. So what happens? The NEC methodology to value change is unconventional. Not only are tendered rates circumvented in preference of using the schedule or shorter schedule of cost components depending on the main option, but assessment is subject to the demarcation of a dividing date of actual and forecast defined cost under clause 63.1, which is the date the project manager instructed or should have instructed the work. The premise of this mechanism is to provide the client with reasonable cost and time certainty, whilst also motivating the contractor to efficiently manage the work associated with the compensation event for which it has assumed the risk in its forecast quotation. So why is this a problem? Well, whilst an element of the work potentially being subject to an estimate may not in itself appear to be an issue, the contractor looks at this as a chance to capitalize, because the earlier the notification, the larger the proportion that will be a forecast. This creates an opportunity to embellish the quotation that will not only include an overly pessimistic output, but in line with the point made regarding time risk allowance in the program section, the contractor also has the contractual right under clause 63.8 to include within its quotation for risk allowances for cost and time matters which have a significant chance of occurring, a subjective parameter that typically sees an additional 10% added to the quotation. The idea behind the forecast is to avoid the common claim scenario towards project completion, a common theme prior to the NEC. However, the subjectivity of the forecast is a constant source of contention. The Northern Ireland Housing Executive versus Healthy Building case, in which the common sense retrospective approach was preferred to the forecast mandated under the contract, has frequently been cited in UK construction and engineering disputes to support the position of recovery of actual costs. Most of you who are au fait with the contract will be citing clause 64.1 at this stage, which obligates the project manager to make an assessment of a compensation event quotation if he considers the contractor has not assessed it correctly. In fact, the project manager is obligated to make an assessment in a particularly broad set of circumstances. Clause 64.1 requires the project manager to assess the compensation event If the quotation is submitted late, has not been assessed correctly in his opinion, there is no program provided with a compensation event, or the latest clause 32 program is not accepted. The project manager also has the benefit of an additional 2 weeks of knowledge, his reply period under clause 62.2. However, the assessment is still meant to be forecast from the dividing date, despite the subsequent knowledge of actuals in the intervening period. The project manager can, however, seek to delay making his assessment until the work associated with the compensation event is completed and the actual costs are known, thereby nullifying the forecast requirement. This is done by repeatedly instructing the contractor to provide a revised quotation under clause 62.4. The project manager's assessment should, of course, still be based on the dividing date, but if his forecast aligns with the actual costs incurred, then the contractor cannot realistically challenge the assessment. Such a tactic can certainly not be considered to be collaborative, but it does nullify any challenge by the contractor seeking to recover actuals based on the healthy building case, in addition to negating any assertion that the project manager did not genuinely believe the decision to be correct, a subjective parameter that was employed by the courts last year in Downs Road v. Laxmanby. So what are clients doing to avoid this? Well, I'm sure we've all seen heavily amended clauses relating to compensation events. That has and always will be the case. In my experience, clients continue to not be comfortable with the forecast quotation mechanism, despite understanding the rationale. And as such, these clauses are frequently amended to either prohibit a forecast quotation, or if it does still remain permissible, then only on the basis that it is subject to a full audit on completion of the event. The final subheading of this presentation is the thorny issue of collaboration. The NEC is underpinned by clause 10.2, which is the parties, the project manager and the supervisor act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. The aim of such a term is self-evident, to promote positive behaviour between contracting parties. But is it not fanciful for two contracting parties with entirely different motives to play nicely together? Also, what does acting in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation even mean? The courts seek to give effect to the intention of the parties, yet to my knowledge, we continue to wait on what the courts consider is required to discharge this obligation. As such, it remains a subjective parameter, and in my experience, is the last line of defence in any argument. Out of interest, and with framework contracts excluded, if anyone has worked on a capital project under the NEC that they consider to be collaborative, please let me know. What is known in England anyway, from Mears v Shoreline, is that an express obligation to act in the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation does not prevent a party from relying upon the express terms of contract. A further English case of note is Gold Group v BDW, which considered the contractual rights in good faith, found that it did not require either party to give up a negotiated financial advantage included in the contract. This really needs to be considered against the reality that the terms and conditions in an NEC contract will have been significantly amended in the client's favour. And in my experience, these modifications are anything but collaborative. As such, any argument which relied on the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation in England would be expected to be ineffective, with the only ramification in the unamended terms being termination for substantially failing to comply with the obligations. The position in Scotland was confirmed last year when the Inner House reversed the decision of the Outer House in Fanord v Tregardos, where it was held that the operation of the explicit terms of contract was dependent on compliance with acting in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, which was considered a counterpart. Whilst the position in England makes a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation toothless, in Scotland, this subjective parameter, if compliance is considered to be found wanting, can effectively disable reliance on the other contract terms. This places a considerable weight on perceived compliance of an undefined contract term. So what are clients doing to avoid this? Well, some clients that I've seen are seeking to avoid collaboration by deleting clause 10.2 in its entirety. While purists of the NEC will consider taking such a step a complete nonsense, given the current dissimilarity in the respective courts in England and Scotland, I would argue that omitting these clauses, 10.1 and 10.2, as well as any other subjective terms, is an astute move. So in summary, whilst it could be considered from this talk that I'm actually against the NEC, this is not the case. The NEC does bring many positives, but in my opinion, there are certainly improvements required. In terms of the improvements, the programme should allow for varying states of acceptance available to the project manager. Fully resourced and costed programmes should be mandated. There should also be commercial ramifications for failure by the contractor to comply, such as disallowing costs or commercial rights of set-off. In terms of compensation events, the assessment mechanism, this requires consideration to ensure that it is uncontentious, which is not the case at present. Whether it is amended to permit a holding sum subject to a final validation on completion of the event, or an alternative, modification is certainly required. Finally, any clauses that are subjective are unhelpful. And for me, this includes the obligation to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. That's the end of the presentation. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. Really interesting.